Deep in the shadows of the Carpathian Mountains, where the mist clings to the jagged peaks like a shroud, lies a history far more terrifying than any Gothic novel could ever conjure. We know the name. We know the cape, the fangs, and the cinematic thirst for blood. But behind the silver screen myth of Bram Stoker's creation stands a man of flesh, bone, and iron. Vlad III, voivode of Wallachia, known to the world as Dracula, and to his enemies as Tepes, the Impaler. To understand the real Dracula, we must strip away the velvet and the supernatural and step into the brutal landscape of 15th century Eastern Europe, a frontier caught in a perpetual, grinding war between the Cross and the Crescent. This wasn't a world of romantic curses. It was a world of survival, where the line between a hero and a monster was drawn in the blood of thousands. Vlad was born into the Order of the Dragon, a secret society of knights sworn to defend Christian Europe against the encroaching Ottoman Empire. The name Dracula itself translates to Son of the Dragon. But as the years of betrayal, captivity, and psychological warfare took their toll, the dragon would morph into something the world perceived as a devil. He was a prince of a crumbling state, a hostage of the Sultan, and a man who learned early on that mercy was a luxury he could not afford. His story isn't just one of cruelty, but of a desperate, borderline psychotic brand of patriotism. We aren't looking at a vampire hiding in a castle. We are looking at a master of psychological terror who used the forest of the impaled as a grisly message to the greatest empire on earth. To know him is to witness the sheer breaking point of the human spirit under the weight of constant war. And today, we are going to peel back the folklore to find the man who inspired the nightmare. We are going back to 1431, to the cold stone rooms of Sigashora, where a legend was born not of magic, but of fire and steel. The childhood of Vlad III was not one of royal comfort, but a masterclass in trauma and political cynicism. Imagine being 11 years old, handed over by your own father to the Ottoman Turks as a human collateral, a living guarantee of loyalty. While his brother Radu thrived in the Ottoman courts, becoming a favorite of the Sultan, Vlad festered. He spent his formative years in the dungeons and the high courts of Edirne, watching how the Ottomans maintained order through absolute, unwavering fear. He witnessed the efficacy of the stake, the slow, agonizing death that would eventually become his signature. This wasn't just a punishment, it was a theatrical display of power. When he finally returned to Wallachia, he found his father murdered and his older brother buried alive by the very boyars, the local nobility. He was meant to lead. He was a man without a family, without a home, and surrounded by traitors. This is the crucible that forged the Impaler. When he finally took the throne for his second and most significant reign in 1456, he didn't come to negotiate. He came to purge. He saw Wallachia as a diseased body, and he believed the only cure was the blade. He invited the boyars to a feast, a gesture of supposed reconciliation, only to ask them how many princely reigns they had lived through. When they boasted of their longevity, a sign of their constant betrayal of previous rulers, Vlad had them seized. The old and the frail were impaled on the spot. The young and able-bodied were marched into the mountains to build his fortress, Ponari, until their clothes fell off their backs and they collapsed from exhaustion. This was the beginning of his justice. He wanted to create a land where a traveler could leave a golden cup at a public fountain and find it still there a month later because the fear of his retribution was more potent than the lure of gold. He wasn't just killing people. He was sculpting a society through the most extreme forms of public execution imaginable. The sheer scale of Vlad's defiance reached its zenith when he stopped paying the jizya, the annual tribute to the Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, the man who had conquered Constantinople itself. This wasn't just a political disagreement. It was a suicide mission. When the Sultan sent envoys to demand payment, Vlad allegedly had their turbans nailed to their skulls, claiming they should have removed them in his presence. This act of grotesque defiance ignited a fire that would consume the Balkan Peninsula. In 1462, The Sultan marched north with a force of 60,000 soldiers, an army that dwarfed Vlad's modest levies. But Vlad knew the terrain, and more importantly, he knew the psyche of his enemy. He utilized scorched earth tactics, poisoning the wells, burning the crops, and driving the livestock into the mountains, leaving the massive Ottoman war machine to starve in a wasteland of its own making. Then came the legendary night attack at Târgoviște. Vlad, disguised as a Turk, infiltrated the Ottoman camp to scout the Sultan's tent, then led a lightning-fast cavalry charge in the dead of night. His goal was simple: assassinate Mehmed II and end the war in a single blow. The camp descended into a chaotic bloodbath as the Turks, blinded by darkness and panic, began slaughtering each other. While the Sultan survived, the psychological damage was absolute. But the true horror, the moment that cemented Dracula's name in the annals of infamy, awaited the Turkish army as they reached the gates of Târgoviște. There, they encountered the forest of the impaled. Over 20,000 bodies, men, women, and children, were hoisted on stakes in a massive, decaying orchard of death. The sight was so repulsive, so profoundly demonic, that even the conqueror of Constantinople, a man hardened by decades of siege and slaughter, turned his horse around and retreated. This was Vlad's masterpiece of psychological warfare. He didn't need to win every battle if he could make his enemies believe he was a devil who had climbed out of the very pits of hell. He weaponized cruelty to compensate for his lack of numbers, turning his small principality into a theater of the macabre that froze the hearts of the most powerful empire on the planet. Yet, as the smoke cleared from the scorched fields of Wallachia, the tragedy of Vlad Dracula shifted from the battlefield to the prison cell. He was a man betrayed by the very Christendom he claimed to defend. Seeking aid from the Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus, Vlad was instead seized and thrown into a dungeon in Visegrad. The king, needing a reason to pocket the crusading funds provided by the Pope, rather than spending them on a war with the Turks, used Vlad as a scapegoat. It was during this period of captivity that the Dracula myth truly began to take its modern shape, fueled by the invention of the printing press. German pamphlets began to circulate, describing Vlad's alleged atrocities in vivid, exaggerated detail, claiming he dipped his bread in the blood of his victims and held mass executions for sport. These were the first true works of character assassination in the mass media age. Vlad spent over a decade in captivity, watching his reputation be dismantled, while his brother, the handsome and Ottoman-loyal Radu, sat on his throne. But the dragon was not so easily broken. Even in prison, stories persisted that he would catch birds and mice just to impale them on tiny sticks. A man so addicted to his method of justice that he practiced it in miniature. By the time he was released in 1475 to reclaim his throne for a third time, he was a hollowed-out version of his former self. A man out of time, surrounded by enemies on all sides, and carrying the weight of a legend that had already outgrown the man. His final reign lasted only months. In late 1476 or early 1477, in a nameless skirmish against the Turks and his own treacherous boyars, the real Dracula was killed. Some say he was betrayed by his own men. Others say he fell in the heat of battle. His head was cut off, preserved in honey, and sent to the Sultan in Constantinople as a trophy. The ultimate proof that the impaler was finally dead. His body was reportedly buried at Snagov Monastery. But when archaeologists opened the tomb centuries later, it was found empty. This final mystery, the missing bones of the prince, provided the perfect soil for the vampire legends to grow, bridging the gap between the historical tyrant and the immortal monster of our imagination. The transition from Vlad the Man to Dracula the myth is perhaps the most successful rebranding of a historical figure in human history. But it leaves us with a profound cultural schism. In the West, fueled by Bram Stoker's 1897 masterpiece, he is the apex predator of the night, a suave, caped aristocrat who trades his soul for eternal life and a thirst for the essence of the living. But if you walk the streets of Bucharest or the mountain passes of Transylvania today, you will find a radically different ghost. To many Romanians, Vlad Tepes is not a monster, but a stern, incorruptible founding father, a cruel but fair guardian who did what was necessary to save his people from total annihilation. There is a famous Romanian poem that laments the corruption of modern politics by crying out, "Where are you, old Master Tepes, to take these thieves and put them in pens and stakes?" This divide forces us to ask, can a man be both a savior and a psychopathic butcher? We have to look at the Table of the Poor, a legendary story where Vlad invited all the beggars and the sick of his land to a great hall for a feast, only to lock the doors and burn the building to the ground. In his mind, he wasn't just being cruel. He was cleansing the state of what he saw as drones who lived off the labor of others. It is this chilling, mathematical approach to violence that makes him more terrifying than any vampire. A vampire kills to eat. Vlad killed to send a message. He believed that the only way to hold back the tide of an empire was to become something more frightening than the empire itself. He chose to become a demon so that his people wouldn't have to become slaves. As we look back through the fog of 6 centuries, the real Dracula remains an enigma wrapped in contradictory chronicles. Was he a victim of the first ever international smear campaign, orchestrated by German merchants and Hungarian kings who feared his power? Or was he a man who truly lost his mind in the Turkish dungeons, emerging with a soul so twisted that only the sight of blood could satisfy him? The truth likely lies in the bloody middle. He was a product of a world where the stakes, quite literally, were as high as they could possibly be. His life was a tragedy of isolation. He fought for a god that allowed him to be imprisoned, for a family that was murdered by his own peers, and for a country that ultimately handed his head to his enemies. When we strip away the fangs and the cinematic fog, we are left with a man who utilized terror as a tool of statecraft, a prince who ruled by the stake and died by the sword. His immortality wasn't granted by a bite to the neck, but by the sheer, overwhelming force of his will and the horrific creativity of his punishments. He remains a warning of what happens when the human spirit is pushed into a corner by history, how a defender of the faith can become the face of evil, and how a name can echo through the ages, not because of the life it lived, but because of the blood it spilled. The real Dracula didn't hide from the sun. He stood right in the middle of it, making sure everyone could see exactly what he was doing with his victims. And maybe that is the most frightening thing of all, the fact that he was entirely, terrifyingly human. To grasp the sheer, agonizing detail of Vlad's methodology, we have to look past the general idea of execution and look at the engineering of his cruelty. Impalement wasn't just a quick death. It was a refined, excruciating science designed to keep the victim alive for as long as possible, sometimes for days. Vlad didn't just shove a pole through a body. He ensured the wood was rounded and greased, carefully guided through the body to avoid piercing vital organs like the heart or lungs. He wanted the weight of the victim's own body to slowly, millimeter by millimeter, slide them down the stake while they remained fully conscious, screaming under the sun, their agony serving as a public clock for the entire city to watch. He would arrange these stakes in geometric patterns, circles, squares, or long avenues, creating a literal forest of the impaled that could be seen from miles away. This wasn't madness. It was an extreme form of order. He once sat to dine in the middle of one of these forests, the stench of decaying flesh and the buzzing of flies thick in the air, calmly dipping his bread into the bowls of blood collected at the base of the stakes. When a subordinate officer dared to cover his nose because of the smell, Vlad reportedly had the man impaled on a stake higher than all the others, mockingly claiming he was doing the man a favor by lifting him above the vile air of the common dead. This level of psychological detachment is what separates the historical Dracula from every other warlord of his era. He didn't just want his enemies dead, he wanted their spirits broken before their hearts stopped beating. This obsession with absolute moral purity through violence extended to every facet of Wallachian life. There is the story of the dishonest merchant who reported a missing purse of gold. Vlad found the purse but added one extra gold coin to it before returning it. When the merchant, trying to be honest under the threat of death, pointed out the extra coin, Vlad spared him, telling him that if he had tried to keep the extra coin, he would have been impaled alongside the thief. For Vlad, there was no gray area, only the law of the stake. He even targeted the social fabric of the family. He was known to impale unfaithful wives and mothers who neglected their duties, often performing these acts in front of their husbands and children to instill a genetic fear of betrayal. He was a social engineer who used the most primitive tools of terror to forge a nation that was, for a brief window in time, the most disciplined and crime-free territory in Europe. But this order came at a price that the human mind can barely comprehend. The stories tell of his cleaning of the sick, where he viewed the infirm and the poor as parasites on the state's strength. He saw a world divided into the strong and the useless, and he took it upon himself to be the ultimate arbiter of who deserved to breathe the air of Wallachia. Every act of his reign was a message to the world that he was the master of pain, and that under his rule, the only path to survival was absolute, terrifying obedience. He transformed himself into a living legend of dread, a man who had stared into the void of his own childhood trauma and decided to become the void itself. The end of the dragon did not come with a cinematic flourish or a stake through the heart, but in the chaotic, muddy outskirts of Bucharest during the freezing winter of 1476. Vlad had just clawed his way back to the throne for the third time, but the world had moved on, and his brand of absolute blood-soaked terror had finally exhausted his own people. As he led a small force of loyal Moldavians and Wallachians against a massive Ottoman incursion, the lines of loyalty blurred. Some accounts suggest he was accidentally killed by his own men who mistook him for a Turk. Others, more cynical and likely more accurate, suggest his own boyars finally saw an opening to end the reign of a man who ruled by the shadow of the stake. When the dust settled, the impaler was found decapitated in a marsh. His head, the most feared visage in all of Eastern Europe, was packed in a jar of honey to preserve it for the long journey to Constantinople. There, Sultan Mehmed II, the same man who had once retreated in horror from Vlad's forest of corpses, displayed the head on a high stake for all the city to see. The irony was absolute. The man who lived by the stake was finally immortalized by one, but even in death, the real Dracula refused to remain silent, sparking a mystery that lingers in the cold stones of Romanian monasteries to this day. Tradition holds that his headless body was recovered by monks and buried at the Snagov Monastery, located on a lonely island in the middle of a dark lake. It seemed a fitting resting place for a man who spent his life surrounded by enemies and water. However, when archaeologists exhumed the supposed tomb of Dracula in the early 20th century, they found nothing but horse bones and ancient rubbish. A second grave nearby contained a skeleton with remnants of purple silk and a ring bearing the insignia of the Order of the Dragon, but the skull was missing. This void in the earth became the perfect vacuum for legend to fill. If there was no body, could the man truly be dead? As the news of his disappearance spread through the centuries, the historical Vlad Tepes began to dissolve into the supernatural Dracula. The printing presses of Germany and Russia continued to churn out the tales of the Voivode Dracula, blending his real-life atrocities with folkloric elements of the Strigoi, the troubled spirits of the dead that rise to drink the life force of the living. We are left with a legacy that is as fragmented as it is terrifying. To the west, he is the monster in the shadows, a fictionalized vampire who represents our deepest fears of the other and the eternal nature of evil. To the east, he is a steel-willed patriot, a tragic hero who sacrificed his soul and his reputation to hold the line against an empire that would have swallowed his culture whole. But the real history tells us something far more uncomfortable. It tells us that Vlad III wasn't a supernatural entity. He was a man who discovered that human beings are more afraid of pain than they are of death. He was a master of the theater of cruelty, a politician who used the human body as a canvas for his messages of power. He remains the most potent example in history of what happens when a person decides that the end justifies the most horrific means imaginable. As the mist rolls over the ruins of Ponari Castle, the question isn't whether the vampire exists. The question is, how much of the Impaler's darkness still lives within the structures of power we build today? Vlad Dracula didn't need to drink blood to be immortal. He simply needed to ensure that the world would never, ever forget his name. So, we stand at the edge of the abyss, looking back at a man who became a myth, not by escaping death, but by mastering it. When you look at the ruins of his real strongholds, stripped of the Hollywood lightning and the plastic bats, you realize the true horror isn't that he might rise from the grave. It's that he was ever here at all. Vlad III didn't need a curse to become a monster. He used the politics of his time, the trauma of his youth, and the cold, hard wood of the stake to carve his signature into the soul of Europe. We love to tell stories of vampires because they give us a way to categorize evil as something other, something supernatural that can be defeated with a silver bullet or a cross. But Vlad was one of us. He was a son, a brother, a father, and a prince. He prayed to the same God as his enemies, and he breathed the same air as the victims he watched die over the course of days. His immortality is a grim reflection of our own obsession with power and the terrifying lengths we go to in order to preserve it. He proved that if you are cruel enough, if you are loud enough in your violence, history will never let you go. Today, the wind still howls through the Borgo Pass, and the shadow of the dragon still looms over the Carpathian peaks. But the real Dracula doesn't live in a coffin. He lives in every document of his atrocities, in every stone of the fortresses built with the sweat of his captives, and in the unsettling realization that his justice was once cheered by those who were too afraid to scream. He is the ultimate reminder that the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones hiding under the bed or waiting in the dark of a crypt. They are the ones wearing crowns, leading armies, and convincing themselves that their cruelty is a form of love for their country. The man is dead, his head long ago decayed in the soil of Istanbul, and his body lost to the shifting earth of Snagov. But the name Dracula remains a chilling echo across the centuries. It is a name that reminds us that while blood might be the essence of life, it is terror that buys a seat at the table of eternity. Sleep well, if you can, knowing that the real history of the Impaler is far more haunting than any story ever written in ink, because this story was written in the very real, very cold blood of those who stood in his way.